Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. At the beginning of Megillat Esther, Haman is identified as the descendant of Amalek, the nation that decided to attack the Jewish people right after it left Egypt, and is infamous for doing so for no reason whatsoever, and for doing so in a despicable way, going after the most vulnerable. Before celebrating the defeat of the wicked on Purim each year, on the Shabbat which precedes the holiday of Purim, in addition to the weekly Torah portion, the Torah portion dealing with Amalek is read. This Shabbat has a special name called Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat of Remembrance. There is a specific mitzvah to remember the evil of Amalek and to eradicate it. We read from Devarim, from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verses 17 to 19. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt, how undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Therefore, when the Lord your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. Various interpretations are offered to understand Amalek's hatred of the Jewish people and their actions, and why Amalek is the arch enemy of Israel. Two which are clear from the verses itself are: one, they represent evil in its purest form, in that their attack was unprovoked. We were a nomadic tribe, we had no territory, nothing to give over. And they attacked the Israelites from behind and went after the weak and the stragglers. Number two, they were undeterred by fear of God. Amalek represents denial of God's existence and seeks to blot out the Jewish people in order to successfully blot out belief in God altogether. Chazal, our rabbis and sages, elucidate that the Jews are commanded to always remember Amalek, to never forget Amalek, and to eradicate Amalek from this world. If you've watched the show at all, you know that I am obsessed with the Jewish calendar, and I see it as an eternal spiral that brings us to certain questions each time of year. And so this time of year is dedicated to asking the question of what does it mean to face evil? What does it mean to think about those who seek to destroy us? And this is something that in some ways might be overwhelming to do every day, but certainly this time of year we're meant to face that question, and certainly in light of what's been happening the past few years, and my guest today will say for the past few decades or longer, is something that we need to think about and spend time really dwelling on. And so on the occasion of Shabbat Zachor, this Shabbat of remembering Amalek, I hope to explore today who or what is Amalek, how do we think about Amalek this year, and what are our obligations related to Amalek today. Joining me to explore these questions is my guest today, Dr. Rachel Fish. Dr. Fish is a scholar warrior. She is the co-founder and president of the nonprofit Boundless, a think-action tank partnering with community leaders across North America to revitalize Israel education and take bold, collective action to combat Jew hatred. Her focus is in the realm of education within higher education and working with middle and high school educators and educational leaders. She serves as special advisor for the Brandeis University President's Initiative on Anti-Semitism, and has served on the faculty at Brandeis, the George Washington University, and Harvard University. Her work has been featured in the mainstream press as well as academic journals, and she co-edited the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century. I want to thank our mutual friend Harriet Schleifer for making the connection and suggesting Rachel as a guest. I want to thank Dr. Fish for flying in today, which we really appreciate. And with that, let's get started.
So nice to be here. Thank you.
We really appreciate it. So, how do you become a scholar warrior? Like, give me the journey
Sure.
From child to scholar warrior, and what that means at the end. Sure.
So I will just say that I was one of these people who was never motivated by a particular title. So maybe some people are. Mm-hmm. And when people say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?"
You were like, a scholar warrior.
Exactly. Meaning I knew, for me, I wanted to be able to teach at the highest possible level. That was very important. And to be able to teach at the highest possible level meant that I needed to go to graduate school. I needed to pursue a doctorate in the fields that interested me, Zionist thought, Israeli history, and how those intersect with Middle Eastern studies and Jewish history.
Wow.
And so I went to Brandeis University, actually, to do that work. And in order to become a scholar, you actually have to immerse yourself in the historiography, the discourse, understand the state of the questions in the field. However, I was never motivated by tenure. I actually don't think that it is a functioning reality, and I think it's completely outdated. So I was never one of these people who wanted to engage in the publish or perish model, but teaching is my oxygen. So I needed to find a way to take the scholarship, work with it to be able to teach in a variety of settings, but core to my DNA is that I'm a fighter. I'm a warrior. And when I see the challenges, and particularly when I saw them very early on, already emerging within the academy, it wasn't enough for me to just be the academic. I needed to find a way to meld those two, hence scholar warrior.
Beautiful. I love that. And I love you being in touch with who you are and putting those to use. So, let's go back, I guess, a few decades. Tell me how, again, certainly not every child says I want to be a scholar warrior when I grow up, and also the areas of interest, anti-Semitism, Jewish history, those pieces you mentioned, Israel. What set you on that path?
So I grew up in a very small town in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, Johnson City, Tennessee. It's Appalachia.
Okay.
It is not New York City. It is very different.
Let's say hi to all our viewers in Johnson City, Tennessee.
Exactly.
Good to have you guys here. Thank you so much.
That's
Enjoy
right.
it.
That's
Great.
right. So we call this area, it's the buckle of the Bible Belt.
Okay.
That's not a negative, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And everyone knows whose church you go to, and everyone knows who doesn't go to church.
Yeah.
And my family went to the only synagogue, which had to be for 6 surrounding towns, for 60 Jewish families at the time. That number is actually declining.
Got it. Wait, Paul, I'll ask you there. How did you get there in the first place? How did your parents end up in?
My parents were both from Cincinnati.
Okay.
My father enlisted during the Vietnam War and finished his residency on an army base in San Antonio, Texas.
Wow.
He's already married to my mom, already 2 kids, and they were trying to figure out next steps in their life. Father had a colleague who said there's this up-and-coming medical community. They need pediatricians.
Wow.
And so my father, along with his colleague, really built the pediatric practice. And not just the practice, the neonatal intensive care unit, a children's hospital. So really, doing good in the world in a place that needed doctors.
Wow. Okay. Got it. And I guess now where the warrior comes from and the scholar comes from, because he sounds like he enlisted himself, which was amazing, and also took his study seriously if he became a doctor that was changing the community in that way.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he and my mother said, if we move here, we have to make Judaism and Jewish life a priority for our family, but that means we have to do it. There's no outsourcing. There was no full-time rabbi.
No one's waiting for you there.
It's totally different. We didn't know any of the sort of Jewish organizational names. I never even learned those names until I was after college. It just wasn't a thing. And so you learn at a very young age, if you don't go to shul, someone can't say Kaddish. There won't be a minyan. And when we were young, we knew that we couldn't go to every Friday night football game. And just to situate you, football is religion, where I grew up as well. So choices have to be made. We would fill our van when we'd go to Cincinnati full of kosher meat to put in the freezer at home, so we would have kosher meat. So it's just a different way of growing up. But why I say this is because when you are so different, at a very young age, you have to be able to articulate who you are and what you believe. Very young. And so sometimes people say to me, how did you know you wanted to teach? I feel like I've been teaching since I was 5. That's the world in which I grew up. And you had to be able to explain why you didn't eat, bacon at the sleepover. And why you couldn't go to certain programs that your friends were going to because it was a holiday. And so it's just a very different upbringing. And my parents instilled in me and my siblings that we should know who we are and from where we come. They also sent us to Camp Ramah because they wanted us to know that there were other Jewish kids in the world.
Beautiful.
And that was really important because we wouldn't have been exposed to that in any meaningful way otherwise.
Right. Wow, what a setup. So you're the token Jew kind of, and not only like you need to represent, and you learn how to be proud of that identity. It's amazing. It sounds like your parents really did that for you. They taught you how to be that person, and then they sent you to camp so you could have the communal peace with people your age.
That's exactly right. I will also say my parents, my mother and my father, modeled for us what it meant to actually stand up for what you believe. Mm-hmm. So there was prayer in the public school system in the name of Jesus every morning.
Right.
My father's not a lawyer. He was a pediatrician. My mother was an incredible stay-at-home mom and a volunteer. Yeah. And they would go to the school board and make the case publicly why this was forbidden, a violation of First Amendment, separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. But they modeled for us how to do that. Mm-hmm. So we learned from them that when something happens, you don't just passively accept it, you challenge it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And so then how do you get from, so it sounds like you were raised to be a proud Jew, in touch with your Jewish identity, someone that wore it on their sleeve. When's the jump to anti-Semitism?
Well, there were a couple of moments growing up in which I directly encountered anti-Semitism. One was as a very young child. I used to make rounds with my father, pre-HIPAA rules. Okay. So we would be in the hospital. I used to love making rounds with him. Yeah. And we went to see a new mom. She just had a baby. He was coming to check out the baby. He asked if I could come in the hospital room. The mother said no problem. And I'm standing near her bed, and she starts to put her hands on my head. She starts to feel. Okay. So my father turns to her and says, "Can you please take your hands off my daughter's head?" Yeah. And this new mother, without hesitating, says, "I'm just trying to feel her horns." Wow. Now, she wasn't hateful. Yeah. But
for our viewers in Tennessee, Jews do not have horns, by the way. Yeah, keep going, sorry.
Or in a lot of places,
yeah, exactly.
we think
keep going.
that. Wow. This was not someone who was hateful, though. This was someone who was ignorant and believed a trope.
It's a painting, I think, isn't it?
That Jews had horns. Yeah. And people thought, well, you cover your head because you have to hide your horns. Right. So I was young. I was 5 or 6 at that point in time. Number 2.
Were you like, what's that?
I was confused.
Your father explained it to you on the way home?
He explained it to me on the way home, but I was confused because...
Moses came down from the mountain with rays of light, is what the Bible says.
Correct, and it was perceived to be horns.
Yeah, beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah. 7th grade. Yeah. I'm walking to the restroom, and I notice someone standing around my locker. When I come back, I go towards my locker, and I see there's a swastika etched into my locker. God. I was 12. Right. Right? I was a 12-year-old girl. And
where are we in time? This is the
middle school.
This is early 90s?
Early 90s.
Okay, fine. Right. The golden era where there was no anti-Semitism in America, in theory. Yeah.
Yeah. And I told the teacher, and I knew who the boy was who was standing there. The teacher told the principal. That evening when we were at dinner, I told my parents what had happened. And there's a phone call during dinner. And I can picture this because the phone was attached to the wall with the cord being strung, through the kitchen, over the kitchen table.
Those are the days.
Right? And my father's talking to the principal. Yeah. And the principal is saying very clearly to him, we don't allow any kind of hatred. We're going to expel this student out of school suspension. So my father's sort of repeating what the principal's saying. Sure. And I said to my dad, that's a terrible idea. And my dad puts his hand over the receiver and he says, the kid etched a swastika. What do you mean it's a terrible idea? Yeah. And I said, I know this kid. He's failed a couple of times already. He has no desire to be at school. He probably doesn't come from a great home environment. And he'd be happy not to have to come. But it's not teaching him anything. Right. So
educator over here.
My father said, what do you want to do? Yeah. And I said, I'd like to meet with him every day and read Diary of Anne Frank. Okay. Now that's the book I knew at the time. Right. Right? Like I was a kid. Yeah. And so my father...
Why are you saying like that? You're saying because you wouldn't do that today?
Well, I'm not sure that's the book I would go to now. Yeah. But as a 12-year-old girl, it makes sense.
Right. It's interesting also, we'll get into this more, I assume, but that kind of, again, the way to... You did Holocaust education was your gut, right? You were like, tell him about the Holocaust, and hopefully that'll...
I think more than just Holocaust education, I felt like humanize who Jews are to him. Right. And that's the book I knew that brought some humanity in.
Interesting, okay.
And Again, it might not have been the right choice, but I think for a 12-year-old, it's appropriate.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm not here to judge your
No,
yeah. The fact that you even were like, don't suspend him, let's give him a book, was pretty cool. Yeah.
So here's the story, though. I wind up meeting with this student every day in the principal's office. He got in-school suspension instead of out-of-school suspension. Yeah. It took months to read this book because we're, doing it in chunks, a little bit at a time. And when you're young and you try to like share the book with someone so they can read with you, he never would read, which also told me something.
Right.
And I think he didn't know how to read, to be honest. Now, this is not an after-school special where this student and I became best friends and hung out.
Yeah.
That's not what happened. But what I can tell you happened is this student never did anything anti-Semitic to me or my younger brother, who was a grade below.
Right.
He always said hi to me through high school. We graduated together. And if nothing else, I think I did do that piece around humanization, where he etched a symbol. I don't actually think he really understood the history, the legacy, the meaning of what that meant. And I don't even think he actually was trying to target me. It's just he knew I was Jewish because everyone knew I was Jewish.
Sure.
So it was a way to like strike some kind of fear, except I wasn't afraid. For me, he was one of these people who was truly ignorant. And I don't think people really saw him for who he was. And I felt like you don't actually punish him. You have to find a way to educate him.
Right. Did you ever get a chance to ask him why he drew the swastika?
I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't. And I'd be curious if this left an impression on him. Right? Like, I can look back on this many years later. And for me, it's still a formative moment.
Right.
It's also a formative moment in terms of just thinking about my parents and how they parented.
Sure.
Right? As a parent now, if my kid said, no, I have a better idea compared to the principal, would I actually listen and be open to it?
Right.
And yet my parents were like, okay, this is what we're going to do because this is what she wants to do. So those were two important moments ever before I left my home, my childhood home.
Right.
And then I went to university, and actually it wasn't until graduate school when I was at Harvard Divinity School, which was then very apparent to me, but I would say not to much of the Jewish world, about what was already happening in the university in terms of creating a fertile ground that cultivated hostility around Israel and the collective political identity of the Jewish people.
Great. So, all right, you're transitioning into our next question, which is, how did we get here? And you're saying you started to notice that. So take me through the college campus thing didn't start on October 7th. You and I've been on programs with you when I worked at the Hartman Institute where you were talking about this well before October 7th, and it goes back further. What did you notice at Harvard Divinity School? What are the larger trends that have been happening on college campuses that have kind of brought us to today?
I want to set the stage for my first day of orientation at Harvard Divinity School.
Okay. This is what year?
This is 2001.
Okay.
Fall of 2001.
Okay.
My first day is September 11th, 2001. Now that's a ominous day.
That was my first week at Penn, undergrad.
So we really didn't know much.
Yeah.
We don't know anyone in the room. We don't know each other. We literally just moved in that weekend.
Yeah.
The Divinity School in general is an odd place. It's the oldest graduate institution of Harvard.
You come, know that.
Yeah. You come for a variety of reasons now. Some because you want to study religion in an academic way. That's why I was there. Some because they want to pursue ordination from a particular denomination. Some because they're interested in taking their social work background or even a business background and then expanding it by including religion and all these other pieces. So people are there for a variety of reasons. We walk into the orientation room and the dean of the Divinity School, who is a scholar of Islam, who is a Christian man from North Carolina, Dean William Graham, walks into the room and pronounces the following. We don't know much. We know a plane left from Boston. But we can assume that what has happened today is because of the United States' support of Israel.
Whoa.
September 11th, 2001.
Wow. I did not expect the sentence to end like that. That's so aggressive. Holy cow.
Now, again, remember, I'm this kid from Tennessee.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I came to Harvard because I was seduced by this idea of veritas.
Right.
I mean, I'm looking and I can see the word etched into every corner of the room.
Yeah. Translate for our viewers.
Truth.
Yes.
Emet.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And that's why I'm there.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, how do you say this responsibly?
Oh my God.
In front of all these people and think that this is acceptable? So that was an immediate warning sign for me. And most people didn't seem to even blink when he said this, which I'm not saying anything about the people in the room, but they're probably thinking, what does it have to do with this? And where's Israel? And I can't even find it on a map.
Right.
So that was my very first day.
Wow.
We also know that we have the second Intifada as a backdrop. We also know Israel had just pulled out of Lebanon. We also know that we are about to see what's happening in Durban at the second Durban conference, at which Israel and Zionism was completely labeled in a way as an apartheid state, again being racist by all these non-governmental organizations. The United States didn't support the Durban II conference. So that's the larger backdrop to all of this.
Wow.
And what was clear through many of the classes I was taking was that there would be faculty in which we were not even discussing Israel, but Israel would be the primary example of all human rights violations. And it felt like something odd is going on here.
Yeah.
Fast forward a few months later, a group of faculty, including the dean of the Divinity School, both from Harvard and then faculty from MIT, put a full-page ad in the Boston Globe calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This is pre-BDS.
Right. Wow.
The movement hadn't even really started yet.
Wow. This is where these things got started.
Exactly. So it was already happening.
Sure.
I wound up, if you recall, after September 11th, there was a huge uptick in global anti-Semitism, but particularly coming from the Arab world. There was dramatization on Egyptian-sponsored television of the protocols of the elders of Zion, right?
I don't recall. That's crazy to think about.
Right, so the protocols...
You were in grad school, I was an undergrad, if that makes sense.
Yes, so the protocols...
I was reading No News.
Right, and so the protocols, this 1903 from the Russian Empire... anonymously written document that says Jews control the media, Jews have outsized influence, is now getting aired on state-sponsored television. Mein Kampf, bestseller throughout the Arab world.
Right. Wow.
So I decided to organize a conference on global anti-Semitism because no one seemed to be talking about it, and I felt like you should talk about it, and the Div School is the place to talk about it. And it was at that conference that one of the speakers, Charles Jacobs, who at the time had co-founded Camera, and he was running an anti-slavery group. And he said that the Div School had accepted funds from the President of the United Arab Emirates, who was promoting at the time anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. So, what do? I called my parents, and without missing a beat, again, you now have a sense of the kind of house I grew up in. My father says, well, Rachel, what are you going to do about it? So I knew it was my responsibility to do something. And I wound up doing a lot of research to understand all of the relationships between the president of the UAE, the money that was given to Harvard, the major think tank of the Arab League at the time, which was called the Zayed Center for Coordination and Follow-Up, which was promoting anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, resurrecting the blood libel from medieval Europe against the Jews, these kinds of things.
Wow.
And I followed the money and exposed what was happening and wound up leading a campaign to have Harvard return $2.5 million and seek reputable funding.
Wow. And that worked?
Yep.
That's crazy.
And it took a while, but it worked.
I didn't know that there were like successes like that.
Yeah, and it's not because I had some major organization supporting. I was just on a mission.
How'd you do that?
So it was real work.
Yeah.
And I had documentation. That's, again, the sort of the desire for the scholar piece. I was really examining
you did your research and
everything. I printed every page.
You walked into like, whose office? And it was like...
So I shared my research along the way.
Give back $2.5,
Right? When I shared it with faculty who would be supportive, what was hard to see was that most of them would rush me in their office and close the door, and then they'd whisper, this is really important. What are you going to do about it?
Wow.
But it was clear that they themselves weren't necessarily going to do anything. When I shared it with major Jewish communal organizations, both on campus and off campus, they said, this is really confrontational. We don't do this. And then they would say, do you want to bring a speaker on campus? And I was like, no, I don't. I don't need a speaker. I need you to help me with this. But they didn't touch it.
Wow.
Then I went to student groups. The Jewish student groups were helpful sometimes behind the scenes, but most of them said, look, we want to go to graduate school, rabbinical school. Like, do we really need to focus on this? When I met with the Muslim Student Association, they said, we understand this is bad money, but you can do really good things with bad money. So who cares? Which didn't seem acceptable to me because, again, it's Harvard.
Wow.
You don't have to take bad money.
Yeah.
And I then just kept pressing and went to university leadership and to donors and made it very clear I would speak to anyone and everyone, and I was not willing to let it go.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay. All right. So you're touching on one, I guess, two themes I've heard you raise so far. One is the sense that the faculty themselves had already come to a place, even back then in the early 2000s, where everything was Israel's fault, Israel was held to a double standard, those kinds of things. And the second is, maybe one leads to the other, but the second is that recognizing that external money is coming in that's trying to influence the agenda of campus.
Absolutely.
Great. And so I guess zoom out for me, what are the larger trends, in terms of how we got here with college campuses in general? What's the melting pot of all the different things that made us here? And I feel like you've been talking about this forever. Obviously, since October 7th, everyone suddenly paid attention. You had people having, pulling back funds from campuses, and I want to hear your opinion on that too. But so, what is shaping? What forces are setting up a situation where the dean of the divinity school responds to 9/11 by saying, "This is Israel"? This has to do with U.S. support of Israel.
That's right. So I would say that, first of all, there are a set of intellectual factors that primarily exist within the humanities. So history, literature, sociology, anthropology, even in some social science courses. Those intellectual factors, I want to be very clear, can be valuable and useful when they are used as a way to engage in critical thinking.
Give me some examples.
Marxism, Orientalism, post-colonialism, postmodernism, which I can unpack all of those.
Yeah, give me a little.
But they all come together and are viewed as a singular prism through which everything has to be refracted, then that's when you have an issue. So let me give some examples. In the 1960s, you start to have Marxist ideology. That ideology is no longer about economics, it's about power. And the framing is those who are weak ought to be strengthened, those who are strong ought to be weakened.
Right. We need even the playing field of power.
Correct.
Okay.
1978, you get Edward Said, professor, Columbia University Comparative Literature, who writes his seminal work, Orientalism. Orientalism should be read. Orientalism needs to be read, in my mind, alongside Bernard Lewis, which doesn't usually happen.
Okay.
But Orientalism becomes basically a Bible in the humanities. Orientalism on one foot says the following: those who are from the West, the Occidental, cannot critique or judge what happens in the East, the Orient. And you cannot impose your Western supposed universalist values on the East.
Right, and again, these are helpful things to hear in a vacuum, assuming that peace will happen because Israelis and Palestinians both want economic prosperity and opportunity. We project onto others what their needs are and how to fix their problems.
Correct.
Right.
So let me give you.
And just say the Bernard Lewis piece and
because Bernard Lewis would challenge the thinking of Edward Said Orientalism, which is why you need to put, if you're really doing.
Right. What was his thing?
Well, Bernard Lewis would actually write ultimately that says you can't understand the region of the Middle East with a Western lens, and you need to understand this is a tribalistic place. That religion is a major component of orientation in the world, that there are elements within religion, especially political theological Islam, that have not gone through a reformation process. And that's going to impact then what happens in terms of relations on the ground between peoples.
Got it. So you're saying those two they complement each other in some ways?
I say they challenge each other.
Okay. So I missed the challenge. What's the challenge then?
Well, because
I thought the whole point was that those in the West shouldn't be assuming they know anything about the East.
Right, but let me give you an example.
Okay.
Take it away from the Israel conversation.
Okay, great.
Okay? When we know that there is female genital mutilation happening in parts of the East, Sudan, Somalia, where are the Western feminists outwardly condemning the violation of women's rights for what's happening in Somalia and Sudan? Nowhere to be found. When we know that there is slavery in Mauritania, Sudan, where are the, again, Western non-governmental organizations condemning slavery and what's happening in Africa or through parts of the Arab world? Nowhere to be found.
And
why?
Yeah, why?
Because Orientalism says you Westerners shouldn't view female genital mutilation as a violation of women's rights. That's a Western idea. This is a cultural practice, and you need to recognize it's a cultural practice of the East, and therefore you cannot critique it. Well, that's insanity. There are Western values that ought to be understood as universal. And when you are in a society in which you are being told you can't critique that, it's a form of soft racism. You can't critique that because of a perception of how you may be understood around critiquing a particular culture, a particular community with different pigmentation of skin.
Great. I got to ask, because you're piquing the question for me. Talk to me about Brit Milah, about bris, right? Because there are countries that have sought to outlaw
That's right.
circumcision, and most Jewish circles say this is anti-Semitic. How do you think through that question there?
Well, it tends to be anti-Semitic because usually it doesn't end with just the Brit Milah. It also usually is about whether or not you can have kosher food and kosher slaughter. And so usually it is about outlawing certain traditional Jewish practices that ultimately don't allow Jews to hold on to their covenantal connection. So
this goes to like the Natan Sharansky, like what they're going after there. This is not
the
about
intent.
Right. In the example of Sudan, you would say that the Western approach there is that you're trying to protect women, and in this approach, you'd say this is not about protecting babies.
Correct.
It's about being anti-Semitic. Okay. Great.
Correct.
Okay. Fine. So you gave me two so far. You gave me Marxism and Orientalism.
Right. So then there's post-colonialism. In the 1960s, you get the idea of post-colonialism. But in the humanities, it's very simplified. Anything having to do with the colonial is viewed as being born in sin. Now, it's not to say that you should whitewash colonialism, but rather to understand the complexity of what happened during different colonialist actions. So you see that again in the 1990s with post-nationalism. Post-nationalism now says everything bad in the world you should blame on the nation state. So they build on one another. You also get in the 1980s postmodernism. Postmodernism comes into comparative literature. Again, it can be a valuable tool on its own. But what it is saying is that narratives are all equal and facts need to be sublimated. Well, I will tell you, as a historian, facts deeply matter. You can build a lot of narratives around facts, but you can't pretend facts don't exist.
And again, the value there is you can develop empathy towards someone else by understanding their side of the story.
Of course.
But if you throw out facts with it, or relatives, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. And as much as you need to build empathy and understand someone else's narrative, narratives aren't always equal. That creates moral relativism. So you have to be mindful of that. Now, if you take all of these together and it becomes the primary lens, you get a very simplistic understanding of Jews and Israel in the following way. Here's the framing. Jews are white. If Jews are white, they are powerful. They are not a minority. If they are powerful, they are the oppressor. If they are the oppressor, you need to understand by extension, Israel is the oppressor, and it is a white colonialist imperialist entity that is seeking to harm and displace a dark-skinned, authentic indigenous population, i.e. the Palestinians. It is superficially flat. There is no nuance. There are no facts. It doesn't take into regard the way in which different people act in history at different moments. It just flattens the conversation. And so it creates a very problematic understanding then of collective political Jewish identity, Zionism, and why Jews have this inherent connection to a place called Zion. It takes away the complexity of understanding the region. It takes away agency from all peoples, like the Palestinians, like the Arab world, and suggests that only Jews are doing to others with an intent to harm. It allows for the demonization. It doesn't understand American Jewry, which says we're all white, which is not accurate, because we know that there are plenty of people on the hard right who would never label Jews white. They will always be the other. And this is where you start to see how Jew hatred continues to transform, and this is another mutation of it.
Okay, so many things to say. First of all, the last word, why do you call it Jew hatred?
So we've done research at Boundless, which is our Think Action Tank, co-founded by my good friend and colleague Aviva Klompus. And we said, even, looking at non-Jews, do people know what anti-Semitism is? The majority don't. They don't know.
So it's accessible language.
So, first of all, in separate research that I was part of, when we asked very young people, 13 to 35 years of age, across America, what is anti-Semitism? The majority responded, IDK. I don't know. Then we heard, well, what's a Semite? Which is a very fair question. It's not a term you hear every day. And then we heard the following. I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-homophobic, I'm anti-Islamophobic, so I must be an anti-Semite. Right, like the construct of the word.
Right, you're going back to Tennessee. People don't know. Okay, beautiful. And then...
but wait, there's a second reason.
Okay.
Wilhelm Marr in 1879 coins the term anti-Semitism. He coins that term because he says this thing called Judenhass, Jew hatred, it's really crass. It's ugly. So we need a politically acceptable way to talk about hating Jews. Wow. And Jews in Europe were referred to as the Easterners, the Orientals, and the Semites. And this is during a racialization process of the Jews. So that's where you get the idea of anti-Semitism. I don't want to use the term by the hater, Wilhelm Marr.
Beautiful. And it's also easier to spell. You have to remember it.
Exactly.
Is there a dash? Is it capitalized?
That's right.
All right, so Jew hatred, I like that. I'm going to try to take that on. Thank you. Yes, Jew hatred. You laid out those four forces that on their own seek to do well, but when all come together, create the situation we're in now. Just add alongside that the money piece of it, right? Because you mentioned your work at Harvard, but is the money piece consciously trying to bring those four together, or is it trying to do something else? What's going on with the money piece of it?
So the money piece is influential in a variety of ways.
Okay.
First of all, you're talking about billions and large sums.
Lay it out for us.
And when I was doing this work as a graduate student, it was pennies. $2.5 million is nothing.
Right.
But we're talking about millions of dollars that influence academic institutions. Sometimes
coming from states, coming from countries,
coming from
or private,
mostly coming from ruling families or elite families connected to the ruling family for those sovereign nation states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates.
Okay.
Now, that money sometimes was directly influencing centers that had to do specifically with the subjects we're talking about, religion, Middle Eastern studies. So you could get at Georgetown, for example, the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, Saudi money. You could get at Harvard, UAE money. So it's coming from the ruling family.
And what's the goal behind it?
So they're influencing not only what will be taught, but who will be taught, who will be teaching.
They're saying we're giving this money, hire this person.
Hire this person, which is a huge red flag. Right? So they're influencing the person that's going to be in the classroom. If you influence who's in the classroom, you're influencing the actual subject.
Everything.
The syllabus, the readings, the materials, the way in which you will then try to make meaning of the world. There were pieces related to public outreach initiatives. What are public outreach initiatives? Programs for K through 12 educators. Come to Georgetown, come to Columbia, come to Harvard, come learn at our Center for Middle Eastern Studies. We will give to you the resources, which are all one-sided and problematic. But if you're an innocent teacher, the majority of these teachers have no expertise on these subjects. You say, I'm going to a lunch and learn, I'm going to professional development at Harvard, Georgetown, Columbia. It's kosher. You have no idea how problematic it actually is. But it is problematic. And this is not a new problem.
Right. Has this been was there like a meeting of the minds that was kind of like, okay, we have a plan here, we're going to try to shape college campuses, and let's focus on college campuses because they have a ripple effect on the next generation of workers, and they affect the high schools and the middle schools. Like, it feels very thoughtful. But
by the detractors.
Yeah.
Yes. So I can't tell you there was a meeting.
Yeah.
But my working assumption is that there was a thoughtful strategy that really looked at where do we influence the world of ideas and how do we do that?
In America.
In America.
Right. Is this happening in other places too, by the way? Is this like Oxford and Cambridge being bought?
For sure it's happening in Europe.
Okay, fine. Okay.
For sure. And then it's not just through the world of ideas, which is education, but it's through elite institutions. Then it's also thinking about, well, what about all those non-governmental organizations? which are working on a variety of these issues. Then it's about how do you influence the elected officials, right? I mean, it may sound like I'm a conspiracy theorist. Right. I am not. What I'm telling you is there was for sure a thoughtful strategy to say, we are going to change the way in which the hearts and minds of Americans exist in order to position a particular cause in a way that ultimately diminishes an understanding of Israel, demonizes, dehumanizes, and puts Israel and those who support Israel on the defensive.
And do you think do you think their core issue is their Israel piece?
I think it's a piece of it.
Right, I assume it's larger. Like when they're creating golf and soccer in these countries, I assume it's also about creating goodwill towards those countries or something along those lines.
But I think right now, for many Americans, this goes well beyond Jews.
Yeah.
This is ultimately about the heart of Western civilization and the liberal democratic values that we care so much about.
Right. That's what's at stake.
That's what's at stake. And the Jews are an entry point into that, which shouldn't surprise anyone.
Right.
And this is a way to start sort of the fraying of democracy and also the disintegration and crumbling of these institutions that we had propped up and thought were not only aspirational and had the ability to change the world, but ultimately, for example, education is one of the most important exports we have. Period. Students come from around the world to want to study at our institution. It crosses all borders. So if you actually are teaching content that isn't educationally sound, but seeks to indoctrinate, it will have a long-term impact, right? So let me give
consciously or not consciously, right?
Correct.
It's in the water at this point.
So just use this as an example. Minister Goebbels, Nazi movement.
Yeah.
His job was minister of propaganda. So what do you do if you're minister of propaganda? You create a lie. And if you create a lie, you repeat the lie. You repeat the lie over and over again so that everyone around you pretty much is like, it must be true.
Right.
And you absorb it and assume it's acceptable. Well, that's what's happened in the 20th and 21st century around Israel, right? You see in 1975, and this stems actually from the Soviet Union, where anti-Zionism became politically correct form of anti-Semitism. They had a minister, some of it was run by Jews even, anti-Zionist Jews in the Soviet Union, who said Zionism is racism. Zionism is colonialism. That language gets picked up, not just through the Arab world, because the Soviets have influence in the region, but it gets picked up by the major international human rights organization, the United Nations. And it's normalized. 1975, UN Resolution 3379, Zionism is racism. Now, it's not until the early 1990s that that's repudiated, but it doesn't matter. The big lie has done the damage.
It's already out there.
Now, in the American Jewish community, there's so much work being done to think about, like, how do you challenge and how do you message differently? I guarantee you that those individuals, whether from the Soviets, now from Iran, whether it's from the Arab world, whether it's from elite institutions, don't sit here and say, you know what, nobody likes to hear that Israelis are the new Nazis, so we shouldn't say it. Nobody likes to hear Zionism is apartheid. It sounds gross. We shouldn't say it. They say it, and it moves the Overton window of what's acceptable.
Right.
And now, those of us who say, but wait, we're not that, are constantly reacting and playing defense.
Great. So you're raising a lot of, I think, core issues at this. So first, I want to ask you about, you mentioned the melting pot that brought us to this moment, right? But we're also, it's Parshat Zachor, we're talking about Amalek, and this is kind of like Jew hatred, as we'll call it, or evil.
Yep.
Is something that seems like eternal going backwards. Hopefully it won't be eternal moving forwards. How do you think about that question? Is this like, well, anti-Semitism, or let's call it Jew hatred. Jew hatreds are going to be there in every generation. It always has a new form. And this, like, in the same way the Jew hatred of the Nazis reflected the academic approach of the times, this is what's happening now. This is the academic approach now. Is that how you think about it?
So I'm one of these people who does not think that Jew hatred ever goes away.
Okay.
Now, I don't think you have to be paranoid about it, and I don't think that it should cause paralysis, and you shouldn't be one of these people at every corner saying, there it is. Yeah. But I think you have to be mindful that Jew hatred will always exist because it continues to mutate. It's a conspiracy theory.
And it reflects the
What's happening in the society, whatever the anti-Semite, right, needs the Jew to be is how the Jew will be portrayed.
Great. So then, zooming out for a second, like, why? Like, is it like God put into the DNA of the world there should always be Jew hatred to like give us a challenge? Like Saul didn't kill enough of Amalek and we messed it up. Like why do you think that is in the fabric of the society? Like I've heard others people say like we're on a mission to do good and those who are evil are trying to stop that mission and we are at the front of that mission and we're the first ones that they want to attack to stop the mission. Like what do you think it is? Right? Because of course we've had times where opposite civilizations who are at war with each other both hate the Jews at the same time. That's right. Right. So
it's a unifying factor.
Yeah, exactly. We can all bond over that. So what do you think? Why is there Jew hatred? Forever, in your opinion?
So first of all, I think part of it is that Jews are perceived as being both subhuman and also all powerful. Well, that's very hard to beat. If you can kill the Son of God, which is the perception, right, that Jews killed Jesus. This is one of the early tropes that we know is highly problematic. And at the same time, be demonized to say the Jews are filth and the scum of the earth, hence those kinds of images of rats and whatnot. How can you be both of those things? So there is something there in terms of the way in which, again, society has to frame the Jew. It's also completely, I would say, irrational. Conspiracy theories are irrational. They're not supposed to be rational.
Right.
The third piece of this is, I would say, envy, which is not a popular thing to say. But if you envy the Jews, then you will always find a way to hate the Jews. That is a natural human feeling. It's an emotion. It's not rational. So that's why I don't think Jew hatred completely disappears ever in any society. Because once you have any kind of societal challenges, you have to find a scapegoat. And the Jew will be the consummate scapegoat.
Why does it have to be the Jew? Why can't it be someone else?
Look, it does often go to other people as well. It doesn't always end with the Jew, but it often starts with the Jew.
Right. I mean, I've seen things that have like these, people point out there's, a list of the accomplishments of Jews, and they'll give the accomplishments of other minority groups that are much more successful than Jews and have all the CEO positions and are blah, blah, blah. And there's not like endless hatred of those groups.
Look, this is why I would say when you look at, try to understand what Jew hatred is, you have to be able to look at it historically and see the ways in which it has shaped over time. First, you hate Jews because of their religious beliefs and those who adhere to those religious beliefs. Then it morphs and it's about a racialization. Now it's morphing again. It doesn't mean those other two are gone, but now in addition, it's about the collective political Jewish identity. It will continue to morph. It has to, because conspiracy theories to remain relevant have to resonate with the societies in which they exist. We have also a population of young people for a whole variety of reasons, and it's not only young people, but young people in particular who are extremely susceptible to conspiracy theories. So it's much easier always to blame someone else than to have some introspection and do the work that you need to do in order to make things better. And we know from research that Boundless has done, for example, that often so much of this hatred around Jews, that's the gateway drug. And then it's, but I also hate women, and I also hate foreigners, and I also hate people of color. And so it's just a starting point for whatever else in terms of hate exists. I do subscribe that part of the work that we are doing is asking the question and trying to figure out how do you make Jew hatred socially unacceptable in the 21st century? Because I will tell you, as a parent, I tell my kids very clearly, you never say this word. This is a word you never use in a derogatory way. Here's the history of this word. My kids know you don't walk out on the street and use certain words.
Great. So that actually, that raises the next question, which I want to get into a little bit now, which is, and we're close to our end. This is flying by. I apologize. There's so much more to discuss with you. We'll have to do a second episode one day. So you've laid out the challenge. How are you imagining, like in Boundless and more broadly, what are you trying to do? What's your approach? So my work specifically focuses in the realm of education. We also do work in the realm of public discourse. In terms of the work related to education, we are very clear that we need to be educating individuals and leaders
who actually are the ones teaching and setting policy. Right. So whether that's at the middle and high school level, whether it's at the higher education level, we have to be in those spaces. But here's the thing, you can't just do education about dead Jews, as Darrell Horn would say, right? So that's not what we do. We talk about the history of Jew hatred and how it has transformed. We teach about Zionism. We teach about the intersection of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and where Israel intersects. We talk about the various manifestations from the hard political right, the hard political left, within radical Islamism. We have to say all the hard things and not shy away from them. Now, I will tell you, there are many individuals, when they hear us say the hard things, they say, you're racist. You're an Islamophobe. The answer is I am none of those things. But if I can't actually tell you what's happening within radical Islamism, Hamas, Hezbollah, then we're not talking about the way in which Jew hatred exists today. So we have to be able to do that kind of work, which requires individuals who understand the historical context. They have the information to be able to put some scaffolding around it. They have language. And then they have to be able to articulate, especially whether it's through policy or teaching to young people or in terms of young adults, why Jew hatred, like any other form of hatred, cannot be an acceptable position and why there has to be greater sensitivity and knowledge around it in order to counter it.
Beautiful. All right, so my question on that then becomes, two things. It's funny, your first story about success with that person in your class, right? Because he never said something anti-Semitic for the rest of the time. You graduated together. He always said hi to you. You were cordial. So I think, I can imagine a bar where we say, like, everyone behaving nicely is success. We've defeated anti-Semitism, right? But then the two offshoots of that that come naturally. One is, okay, so it's hiding in rooms that I'm not in, and they're saying it behind my back. Is that still success? If it's just like, oh, all this stuff's happening, we just don't say it in front of you. Or they find a different way to use the language. Oh, I don't hate Jews, I hate Israel, or 9/11 was because of U.S. support of Israel, that kind of thing. So what does success look like? Is it everyone stops saying inappropriate things when we have these kind of two other options where they can get around it anyway?
Right. I mean, obviously, it's not enough just that people then say it quietly behind your back or in secret corners of the room.
It shapes the goalpost, right? It's an important piece of it. It shapes, if they're using language here, then there's success in moving the language here. But
That's
keep
right.
going. Yeah.
I mean, and if you compare the way in which Jews or the Jewish state are discussed today in a lot of these settings, and you substituted any other community, you would probably feel a real ache in your gut. If you feel that ache in your gut, something's wrong, right? So part of this is helping people understand that right now what has happened in our society is the moral guardrails have been so far lowered that it has now been normalized to think it's okay to say the things that are said about Jews or the Jewish state. That's a problem, right? If we have a population of Americans who think that Zionism is a form of white Jewish supremacy, which we do, that's a problem, right? So part of this is you have to be able to help people understand what these things really are, because then they can't say, well, I didn't know. No, you do know, and now let's be clear about what your intent is. The other thing is there have to be clear consequences. If you have, for example, foreign students who are violating the school's code of conduct, they don't have to stay on our territory. They don't. We don't have to give them any education, right? If you have faculty who abuse the classroom, if they abuse the classroom for any other community, they wouldn't be able to hide behind tenure.
They'd be canceled, as they say.
Right, and I'm not looking to cancel, but I'm looking to show very clearly that there can't be a double standard for one population versus the Jewish population.
Great. Okay, last question. You mentioned kind of fighting back in Harvard, the $2.5 million, and how the Jewish organizations were scared, the teachers were whispering, all those pieces of it. We read in the Haftorah, the special portion for Zachor, about King Saul is commanded to destroy all of Amalek. He lets the king of Amalek, I think Gog or Gog of Amalek, survive. He doesn't kill the animals who he was supposed to kill as well, right, the cattle. And there's like this moment of like his empathy holds him back and he doesn't kind of finish the job. Yada, yada, yada. We have Haman, we have today, all those kinds of things. What do you think, I don't want to blame the victim. It's very important to be careful about it. I've learned that. But do you think the Jewish community is hesitant to be full force in fighting against Jew hatred? Like, what's going on there? Is there something that we don't want to come off as too powerful by trying to fight for ourselves? And then sometimes it gets turned into these weird things of like calling out people that aren't, and like, what's going on there?
Yeah. So one is you need to know exactly the form of Jew hatred that may be exhibited. You need to be able to identify it and label it clearly so you know how to address it. Then you need to know the different tactics. Sometimes you need to call in and educate. Sometimes you need to call out and have clear consequences.
I like that.
Right? So you need to be able to sort of know the distinction, and those are tactics. I think that part of the challenge here too is that for me, I want to impact how people think, how people feel, and how people behave. That doesn't happen overnight with some magic wand, right? That takes a very long time. So then it's trying to figure out, so what are the short, medium, and long-term interventions that need to occur? But I think part of this larger conversation that we sort of have to understand in the American Jewish context now is that American Jews, for the most part, grew up thinking America was exceptional. And in many ways, it is exceptional. And it's exceptional for the Jewish historical experience. And yet, there's still a history of Jew hatred in this country, not the same as Europe, but it still existed, and it exists today. And for many American Jews, they didn't imagine it could exist today, and so they're confused when their kids say, look what I saw online, or here's what happened on the soccer field, or here's what happened by my teacher. And the parents of those kids do not have the language, they don't have the knowledge, and they don't have the ability to talk about this, and they assumed it could be outsourced to rabbis, Jewish communal leaders, etc. And the Jewish communal institutions that we have, as important as they may be, were built for a different time. They were built for a time for social welfare. Now that's really important. But right now we need a State Department. And a State Department needs to be able to go on the offensive. And we're not ready, we're not there, and we aren't prepared, and we don't have a strategy.
On that somber note, I will say, again, our tradition brings us to face this question head on, and I think you're raising a lot of the important points, and hopefully it'll inspire people to take action. They can go to boundlessisrael.org to learn more about your work, to get involved. I hope that this time next year, we'll have less to say about anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, and Amalek, and I hope you're wrong that it's not an eternal challenge, and we get rid of it, but we'll see. Dr. Rachel Fish, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.